Is Code of Conduct conversations in open source software projects on GitHub. The Code of Conduct is important for self-governing communities. A Code of Conduct is a document of rules, guidelines, and values for a particular group, and it can be used for moderating the behaviors of people in that group. So in this study, we're looking at the Code of Conduct specifically within open source software development communities. And on the right is the Contributors Covenant, one of the most popular Code of Conducts used. And even though it's from that one context, there is wider implication for other types of self-governing communities. The common values in Code of Conduct includes helpfulness, responsibility, and respect. So on the right are standards from the Contributors Covenant, and they emphasize things like demonstrating empathy and kindness towards other people, being respectful, and accepting and giving feedback graciously. So all those things to have a healthy community that is inclusive and helpful. And we have two different threads of research we're drawing on. On the left is the greater one of community governance, where there's been a lot of work, but there's really not too much work on Code of Conduct usage in open source. So we know how often the Code of Conduct is included in an open source project, and we know what type of information the Code of Conduct contains. That's just from a small handful of studies that have been done, but we don't know how the Code of Conduct is actually used in practice, especially in open source. So we're motivated by that gap, by the lack of empirical work on the Code of Conduct. And we're curious on how the Code of Conduct is added into a new project, how it can be modified through its lifetime by the community, and then especially how it actually gets used, how it's implemented, and whether that is making the community better. So to answer these questions, we conducted a qualitative analysis of the conversations on Code of Conduct on GitHub, and developed a typology to describe what we found. For the methods, since our main data is the issues and the conversations they contain, we start with just a list of a large, diverse list of GitHub projects, and we found that about 6,000 of them have a Code of Conduct. From there, we queried for issues with keywords of Code of Conduct and COC, as it's often abbreviated, and we found about 7,000 issues which the Code of Conduct was mentioned in some way. Then we developed the codebook and iterated on the different categories until we believed that they were sufficient, and then had 3 different researchers using that typology to classify different issues and identifying which one they belong to establish good interlocutor agreement, and we had a Cohen's kappa of above 0.7. After that, we took 400 fresh samples to populate the codebook. So the methods consist of identifying the relevant conversation data and then developing the codebook. Okay. Some of the issues we found were for adopting a Code of Conduct or crafting it. And so those conversations show the community's values, as we'll see later on. And some of the other issues were about the actual usage of the Code of Conduct and enforcing it when someone does something that is against the Code of Conduct's values. Okay, so some takeaways. We found that there's little engagement upon the initial adoption of the Code of Conduct. So here is just a example where some project is adopting a Code of Conduct, and then we get some emojis supporting it, but there's very little, at least publicly seen, interaction with it. But we also see some examples of group members suggesting edits to the Code of Conduct to increase inclusion. In this example, someone is saying that the meaning of sexualized language and whether that's okay or not okay should be clear. And they're afraid that this could become a heavy-handed, intolerant policy instead of a reassuring one. And in this example, even though it's talking about documentation, it's in a similar type of direction, asking for more inclusive language in the docs. There's quite a few instances of words like simple in the documentation. Unfortunately, words like this can be disheartening to people who are newer and don't find things to be simple. So here we see examples of community members having deep consideration for how these governance documents can affect other people. Okay, We often saw projects which require the contributors to read and agree to the code of conduct as part of checking in code. Here, the code of conduct is used as part of the community socialization, and project maintainers are getting buy-in from the community and using the code of conduct as a sort of DIY governance tool. And the actual evaluation of violations can be subjective and involve language barriers. And so the actual determination of whether something that is said is rude, aggressive, or generally not acceptable is a subjective matter by whoever is using the code of conduct to do this moderation task. Because usually there's no real rule or strict standard of what is okay and what is not okay. And so we see some interesting examples in which, in this one, the non-native English speaker apparently did not mean to be offensive, but was moderated for his speech because what he said, the word unacceptable, was not okay. And so this brings us to interesting question of whether the code of conduct is actually inclusive if someone from a different language background is not able to know of whether they're saying is okay or not. And last takeaway, memes, jokes, and concerns when the issue is controversial. So even though the code of conduct gets little attention on a day-to-day basis, when there is a controversial topic, the entire community can weigh in and reference it, whether it's in serious intent or not. In late 2019, Visual Studio Code received this issue, Santa Hat on VS Code Insiders, pushing religion is very offensive to me. Someone found offense with the Santa Hat icon and opened an issue about it. And Microsoft said that they are sorry and removed the Santa Hat. But following this was a storm full of some serious, some not so serious comments about how this issue should have been handled and their anger with how Microsoft dealt with this. And many users actually commented that Microsoft was in violation of its own code of conduct when they just acted without consulting anyone else just to remove that icon. So this shows that people are aware of the code of conduct when there is a controversial topic, which is especially one which is interesting to them. So in conclusion, we have some empirical learnings of the usage of the code of conduct, and we contribute a typology of conversations around the code of conduct. We observe that there's little public discussion, but some iteration on the code of conduct when it's introduced. And the evaluation of the actual violations can be subjective. And lastly, there can be a lot of community weigh-in during controversial topics. Thank you.